Funny thing about the mail train, it does not always bring what you ordered. Some men learn that with a broken rifle or a crate of seed that sprouts nothing but weeds. I learned it with a bride. I stood on the platform at Cheyenne the day the wind came riding down from the hills and the sand lifted in tiny devils at my boots. I had a picture in my pocket. A pretty girl with a silk bow and a smile that made promises no range could keep. I had studied that face for months. I had written to it at night when the lamps burned low and the cattle settled and the coyotes called the hour. I had bought a ring I could not afford. I had convinced myself I was ready for gentle talk and curtains and a piano no one could play. The whistle blew. Steam rolled over the platform like breath from the nostrils of some iron horse. Doors opened. People poured out with their bundles and their careful hopes. I took off my hat and ran a sleeve across my brow and tried to stand like a man who knew what he was doing. Soldiers do that when they are afraid. Ranchers do the same. A conductor shouted, and a porter swung a trunk to the boards, and I saw her. Not the girl in the picture, not the silk bow, a different one. Plain dress, dark hair braided and pinned, dust on the hem and courage in the lift of her chin. She came searching the faces and landed on mine like a bird that had flown too far to turn back. I do not remember what I said first. I remember what I did not say. I did not say, "You are not her." I did not say, "I have made a mistake." The words felt like bad water I could choke on if I let them rise. She reached me and folded her hands together. They were small hands, but hard from work. She said my name, Jesse Caldwell, not as a question, as a fact. Then she told another fact. I am Annie. My sister was meant to come. She did not. There is a mercy in certain truths. They cut quick and clean. Most lies drag their feet and leave you bleeding in the dust. I looked at Annie and felt something in me steady. A soldier learns to accept the ground under his boots even when it shakes. A rancher learns the same when the river swells or the sky withholds its rain. What stands will stand. I said, "All right, we will go talk." She nodded once, as if she had expected me to turn on my heel and walk away. Yet when I did not, a line of tension left her shoulders. Not all of it, enough to breathe. We walked past the freight office and the line of wagons and out toward the hitching rail where my bay gelding waited with the patience of a friend, too loyal to ask why. Cheyenne smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat and biscuits from a boarding house that never kept decent hours. Annie kept pace beside me. She did not reach for my arm. She did not try to be pretty. She tried to be steady. I noticed that before I noticed the color of her eyes, gray when the light caught them, storm gray, honest. I told her the truth that I could manage. I had written long letters. I had expected another girl. I had made a place at my table and a frame near the lamp. She listened with her head slightly lowered like a ranch hand catching orders on a busy morning. Then she told me her piece. The family needed the pretty one to stay. A marriage was brewing back home that would soothe old pride and mend a fence that had stood crooked for years. Money had been spent on ribbons and parties and talk. They sent me instead, she said. If you want me to turn around, say it now. I have stood in dust storms where a man could not see his own hand in front of his face, and I have known when to tilt my back to the wind and wait. That was such a moment. Something in her voice made space in the heat. I heard no apology there, no angle, no tremble meant to beg. She was not bargaining. She was telling me where the ground was. "You hungry?" I asked. She looked surprised, then almost smiled. I could eat. We found a place that would not mind the dust and ordered eggs and coffee and a little ham that tasted like it remembered a better pig. She folded her napkin before she ate, the way women do who have been taught to make order out of less than enough. I told her about the ranch, about the creek that ran fat in spring and thin in August, about the cottonwoods that rattled at night like loose money, about the hill where the wind was sweeter than it had any right to be. She told me she could cook and mend and keep accounts and set a broken wing on a hen. She told me she was not pretty, not like her sister, and she was not ashamed of it anymore. A man learns the weight of words. That one lay gentle on the table and did not move. "You will ride," I said after we had eaten. "It is a day and a night to the ranch if we make fair time." She nodded. She had not brought a trunk, only a carpet bag with a small Bible and 2 dresses and a wooden comb. I carried it to the wagon and set it by the seat. The sun leaned west, and the sky took on that stretched look it gets when the plains are wide open and a man feels both rich and small. I helped her up. Her boot found the spoke, then the board, and she sat straight with her hands lightly on her knees. I climbed beside her and clucked to the team, and we rolled out. I had not decided anything yet. That is the clean truth. A man can drive a long way inside his silence. Wheels hummed on packed earth. Birds sliced the air as if cutting cloth. Now and then Annie asked a question in a quiet voice. How many head? Where the nearest church? Whether the roof on the south shed kept the rain, or if it needed tar. Practical things. Not a single one about romance or lace or the color of the room that would be hers if I asked her to stay. I felt the knot in me loosen. I did not know I had been holding it since the war. Night took us in a soft way. The sky opened its book and set down 1,000,000 words in light. I camped us by a stand of willow near a slow bend of river and made a small fire against a stone. She did not wait to be asked. She found the coffee in the skillet and moved with that quiet economy I had seen in women who learned early that time is a partner, not a servant. She fried biscuits and bacon grease and handed me one on a tin plate. We ate without hurry. Crickets tuned the dark. A few cattle lowed on a distant range like old men talking in their sleep. Afterward, she took the little Bible from her bag and set it by her blanket, but did not open it. I asked if she wanted me to take first watch. Habit. She shook her head. Not a smile exactly. Something close. "We are not at war, Mr. Caldwell. You can sleep." I lay back then and looked at the stars and let the past run through me like water through sedge. The places where the shooting had been worst. The mornings when a man counted who was left and learned to swallow his own name. Somewhere in there, a picture of a silk bow came up and tried to claim its old seat. It looked foolish now, like a promise written by a stranger who does not know the road. Near midnight, I woke to the rustle of her dress. She had gotten up to put another stick on the coals. Her face in the low firelight was not pretty. It was better. It was true. She saw my eyes open and did not startle. "Go back to sleep," she said. "Morning comes early and the road is still long." I watched her settle and turn on her side and tuck the shawl beneath her chin. The air smelled of willow and ash. I closed my eyes and felt the ground hold me. It had been a while. By dawn we were moving again. The wheels sang. The horses leaned into the traces with the calm of creatures who do not lie to themselves. I showed her the line where my land began, and the bluff where the hawks kept counsel, and a little grove where a man could stand and hear the whisper of the world. She listened as if these were gifts. Later, much later, I would tell people that I chose her there in that early light, when she put her hand on the rail and said nothing but yes to the day. But that is getting ahead. For now, I only drove and let the truth work like yeast in a bowl of dough. Slow, sure, quiet, just breathing. By the time the sun burned down to a copper coin and slid behind the ridge, the outline of my ranch rose out of the haze. 2 barns, a house with a porch that leaned but never fell, and a stretch of pasture that reached so far the grass lost its color at the horizon. I slowed the dinghy and let the wagon creak to a stop. Annie looked out across it, quiet as a prayer. "No wonder," she said softly. I asked what she meant. She pointed toward the barns, toward the line of cottonwoods trembling in the dusk. "It looks like a place that remembers everything." She was right. The land did remember. The drought years, the thunder that took the barn roof once and near took me with it. The winter I dug a grave for my father and buried a horse the same week. Every inch of soil had a story pressed into it by hooves and heartbreak. When she spoke, it was like the land recognized her voice. We unloaded what little she had, and I took her inside. The house smelled of coffee grounds, leather, and the faint trace of solitude. I had swept it that morning, thinking I was preparing for someone else, but the air already seemed to know she belonged. She took off her gloves and ran her fingers over the rough edge of the table. She said, "This is good wood. It holds." There were 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for everything else. She put her carpetbag by the chair and waited. A man feels clumsy at such a moment. I told her she could have the bed, and I would take the cot in the shed until things were sorted. She shook her head. "I am not asking for favors, just a fair chance." Her words landed with the weight of promise, not pride. That first night, we ate beans and cornbread and drank what was left of the coffee from the road. She ate like someone who knew the cost of each bite. I tried to find words that would fill the silence, but she did not seem to need them. The wind moved through the cracks in the boards, humming low. After a while, she said, "You fought, didn't you?" I nodded. She asked no more. That was mercy. I lay on the cot and listened to her breathing settle on the other side of the wall. There was a rhythm to it, like rain against tin. I thought of the letters I had written to the sister I would never meet. All those hopes stretched thin and fragile. I thought of the woman sleeping now, steady as a heartbeat, and wondered if Grace sometimes wore the wrong name on purpose. Morning came clear and gold. I woke to the smell of coffee that wasn't burned and the scrape of a skillet. Annie stood at the stove with her hair twisted up, sleeves rolled, moving as if she had always known this kitchen. She had found flour, lard, eggs, and a jar of honey I had forgotten in the cupboard. I watched her a while before I spoke. "You work fast." She glanced over her shoulder. "Work keeps the soul steady." We ate at the table without much talk. The light through the window laid bars of gold across her hands. After breakfast, she washed the dishes and hung them to dry, then stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the fields. "You run this place alone," she said. I told her I hired hands at branding time and kept one boy through the summer, but mostly, yes, alone. She nodded, considering. Then she said, "Not anymore." There was no grand declaration, no smile meant for storybooks. Just those words, plain and certain. They hung in the air like the sound of a bell fading across open land. I did not know then how far they would reach. We spent the day setting the house to rights. She mended a curtain with thread so fine I could not see it move. She swept, dusted, found order in corners I had forgotten. I fixed a hinge on the back door and a loose step on the porch. By noon, the place looked like it had drawn its first clean breath in years. When the chores were done, she took a seat on the porch rail. "Tell me about her," she said. "Her sister, the one in the picture." I looked toward the fields instead of her face. She was the kind of pretty that made men forget themselves. Laughed too loud. Wrote like she was playing a tune. I thought I wanted that. Annie said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "You probably did, but what you need might be different." Evening slid over the plains, slow and wide. Sky caught fire, then cooled to indigo. I brought out my old guitar, strings a little rusted, neck worn smooth. She listened while I played a tune I remembered from the army camps, something about going home and never quite getting there. When I finished, she said, "Maybe home isn't a place. Maybe it's a person who stays." Her words lodged in me like a seed under good soil. I looked at her then, truly looked. The dust on her boots, the small scar near her wrist where life had already left its mark, the calm in her eyes that did not ask for anything but truth. Later that night, a storm rolled in from the west. Lightning flared beyond the ridge. Thunder followed like distant artillery. I felt the old twitch in my chest, the one war left behind, a quick pull of fear that comes before you can name it. I must have moved, because she was suddenly there, hand on my arm. "Just weather," she said, "not shells. Just weather." Her hand stayed a moment longer than it needed to. The rain came down hard, beating the roof like hooves on packed earth. She went to close the shutters, and I followed, holding the latch while she drew the window tight. For a breath, we stood close enough to share the same flicker of lightning across our faces. The air smelled of dust, turned sweet by rain. I wanted to tell her something then, something about how silence can heal if two people hold it right, but the words would not line up. She turned away first, back to her small bed, and I stood watching the water run down the glass until the night softened. When dawn broke, the world was washed clean. The earth steamed, the sky stretched blue and new. Annie stepped outside barefoot, let the wet grass touch her toes, and lifted her face to the morning. She looked young, almost unscarred. I felt a pull in my chest, not desire, not yet, just the ache of recognition. She was the kind of soul that stayed when others drifted. That day, we began the work proper, fences, feed, the endless rhythm of survival. She learned quick. By the end of the week, she could saddle a horse, milk the cow without spilling, patch a leak in the trough, and cook a stew fit for a king out of scraps. She whistled sometimes, soft tunes that carried through the yard like something fragile refusing to break. I found myself waiting for those sounds, marking the hours by her voice more than the sun. Nights grew easier. I dreamed less of the war, more of the sound of coffee pouring, of a woman humming in the half-light. It was on the 10th day that a letter arrived, not from the supply post, from back east, her sister's handwriting on the envelope, neat and fine. Annie found it in the mailbox and brought it inside without opening it. She set it on the table and stood looking at it as if it might speak. I asked if she wanted privacy. She shook her head. "Letters don't bite," she said, but her hands trembled. She opened it slow. I watched her eyes move across the lines, watched the color drain from her face. When she finished, she folded it once and laid it flat again. "My sister is married," she said, "to a banker." The words sounded both relieved and hollow. Then she added, "She says she hopes I'm well." There was more she didn't read out loud. I could see it in the way her mouth tightened, in the way she looked toward the window, but didn't see it. I said, "Do you want to write her back?" She thought a moment, then said, "Not yet. Some things are better lived than written." That night, she left the letter on the mantel. I saw her glance at it once before she blew out the lamp. It caught the last bit of light and glowed, a reminder of all the roads that had forked and never met again. Days passed. We fell into a rhythm that felt like breathing. Work, food, quiet. The land seemed to take her side, softening in color, giving back a little more grass, a little more water in the creek. I caught myself thinking that maybe the Lord had not sent me the wrong bride at all. Maybe he had sent the one I needed to learn what choosing really meant. The thought scared me because it felt too much like peace. I had not trusted peace in a long while. But when she laughed at something small, a calf nosing at her apron, or the rooster losing a fight with its own reflection, I felt that fear loosen, grain by grain, until the sound of her laughter settled into me like a hymn I had almost forgotten how to sing. Summer rode in hard that year. The grass turned brittle underfoot, and the creek that split the pasture ran thin as wire. By the third week of June, dust hung over the land like smoke from an old fire that never quite died. Annie tied her hair up with a strip of cloth and worked beside me through the heat. She did not complain. When the sun came down, mean and sharp, she'd lift her face to it, squint and say, "Feels honest." I'd laugh and shake my head. Only someone born for the hard kind of living would call that sun honest. The cattle grew restless. I spent long hours mending fences and counting heads. Every evening I'd see her out by the wash, sleeves rolled, beating the dirt out of shirts with a rhythm that matched the wind. There was a grace to it, quiet and certain. She made even hard work look like part of a prayer. I'd stop sometimes and watch her, the way the light caught her shoulders, the way she hummed without knowing it. It wasn't the hum of a song you learn. It was the kind that grows out of contentment and memory both. One evening, the sky broke. A storm rolled over the ridge, black as judgment. The cattle bunched near the fence, noses high. I shouted to Annie to stay in the house, then ran for the corral. The first drops hit before I got the gate open, big and cold. Lightning cracked across the plain, wide enough to turn the world into bone. I was halfway through driving the last steer toward shelter when I heard her voice, thin against the wind, calling my name. She was running through the rain, skirts heavy, hair loose. I yelled for her to go back. She didn't. She grabbed the lantern I dropped, held it steady against the wind, and shouted, "The calf's out by the gully." I followed her point and saw a small shape caught in the mud, legs tangled. We reached it together, the water rising fast. I pulled the rope from my belt and waded in. The ground gave way under me, cold up to my waist. The calf bawled, wild-eyed. Annie threw the end of the rope to me, braced her boots in the muck, and hauled when I shouted. The rain came harder. We worked without speaking, both grunting with effort, both soaked to the bone. When we got that animal free, it stumbled up the bank and vanished into the dark like it knew the way home all along. I turned toward her. She was standing in the downpour, face streaked with rain and mud, breath coming quick. I'd seen men in battle look less alive. "You fool," I said, "you could have been swept away." She smiled, rain running off her chin. "So could you." For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then she reached out, brushed the mud from my cheek, and said, "Guess that makes us even." When the storm broke, the air smelled of clean earth and something close to forgiveness. We walked back to the house, boots squelching, clothes heavy. Inside, the fire still burned low. She knelt by it, pulled off her wet gloves, and held her hands toward the flame. I found a blanket and laid it around her shoulders. She didn't thank me, just looked up with that steady gaze that didn't need words. Later, after she'd gone to bed, I sat by the window and watched the rain taper off. The land would drink deep tonight. The cattle would settle. Tomorrow, the creek would run clear again. I thought about her voice in the storm, that fearless note that cut through the thunder. It stayed with me. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in that lightning flash, mud-streaked, stubborn, shining like truth come to life. Morning found her already at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair still damp but braided tight. She was frying eggs and humming the same tune she always did. When she noticed me watching, she said, "You'll catch cold sitting up like that." I told her I'd had worse nights. She poured coffee, handed me a cup, and said, "Then this'll fix it." The way she said it made me think she wasn't talking about the coffee. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm. The storm had settled something between us, though neither spoke it. We worked side by side, her laughter slipping through the dust like a bomb. Once, while we were mending a fence, I caught myself saying, "You ever think you were sent here for a reason?" She paused, hammer halfway raised. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I just stopped running." The ranch began to breathe easier. The cattle fattened. The garden she planted took hold, stubborn and green. I found myself whistling again, tunes I hadn't remembered in years. Nights came soft, filled with crickets and the whisper of wind through dry grass. The nightmares faded to shadows. Then, one afternoon, I rode into town for supplies. The postmaster handed me a letter sealed in blue wax. I knew that mark. It was from Evelyn. I rode back slow, turning it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it. When I got home, Annie was kneeling by the trough, scrubbing the last of the mud from a pail. I held the envelope out. She looked at it, then at me. Her face didn't change, but her eyes did. She wiped her hands on her apron, took the letter, and sat on the porch. I went inside, gave her space. Through the open door, I could hear the paper tear, the soft crackle as she unfolded it. Silence followed. Then the sound of the page closing, careful, final. She came in, set the letter on the table. She says she's sorry, Annie said. She says she should have told me sooner that she wasn't coming, that she thought I'd understand. She says she hopes you're happy. I asked, "And are you?" She looked out the window toward the pasture. I don't know yet, but I'm not sorry. That night we didn't talk much. The air between us held the quiet kind of peace that comes after a storm and before something new. I fixed the hinge on the back door. She read a few verses from her Bible under the lamplight. When she finished, she looked up and said, "Maybe love isn't something that arrives on a train. Maybe it's something that grows while you're fixing fences and saving calves." I thought about that long after she went to bed. She was right. The kind of love that lasts isn't delivered in a parcel or wrapped in ribbon. It's built in the slow, stubborn days, in the sweat and silence and shared coffee. It's the kind that doesn't need to be pretty to be real. Weeks passed, each one stitching us closer. The first morning, I heard her humming inside the barn. I realized the place no longer sounded empty. She filled the air with something that wasn't noise, wasn't words, but made everything alive. Then came July, and with it, heat that split the earth and dreams that woke me sweating. The war crept back some nights. Faces smoked the sound of men falling. I thought I'd left it behind, but memory has long legs. Annie never asked, but she knew. One night, she found me outside, sitting by the fence, staring at nothing. She brought a blanket, draped it over my shoulders, and said, "You can let the past rest, Jesse. It's done with you if you're done with it." I said, "Some things never quit." She answered, "Then don't fight them. Let them walk beside you till they fade." I looked at her then, the moonlight catching her hair, and I realized I'd stopped seeing her as a replacement long ago. She wasn't sent instead of someone. She was sent in time. The kind of grace that shows up dusty, uninvited, and exactly right. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. We sat there until the stars tilted west and the first hint of dawn touched the sky. Somewhere in that quiet, I made the choice I should have made the day she stepped off the train. I chose her, not as a duty, not as a trade, but as the truth I could finally live with. By August, the world had turned the color of old brass. The wind came down from the hills hot enough to sting the lungs, and even the creek whispered instead of sang. Annie kept a damp cloth over her neck when she worked outside. I told her she didn't have to help me mend fences in that heat, but she said, "A home doesn't mend itself." She said it with the kind of calm that could quiet a storm. One morning I found her in the garden, kneeling among the beans, the hem of her dress dark with dew. The light hit her hair, and for a moment I saw her not as she was, but as she would be years from now, lined by sun and laughter, steady as the horizon. She looked up and caught me staring. "You're thinking too hard again, Jesse." I told her maybe so. She smiled, brushed her hands clean, and stood. "Then come eat before the day gets mean," she said. We ate breakfast on the porch, coffee thick as syrup and biscuits that smelled of heaven. The sound of crickets folded into the hum of the day. She talked about wanting to whitewash the house, maybe plant flowers by the steps. I said it sounded fine. Truth was, I liked seeing her dream out loud. It made the place feel permanent. After breakfast, she went into town for flour and salt. I stayed to fix the wheel on the wagon. Around noon, a shadow fell across the yard. I looked up to see a rider approaching, dust trailing behind like smoke. A man, maybe 30, wearing a clean vest and a hat too fine for honest work. He reined up near the porch and tipped his hat. "You Jesse Caldwell?" I said I was. He smiled like someone used to being admired. "Name's Jonah Cooper. Came looking for a Miss Annie." The words hit like a spark in dry grass. He dismounted easy, eyes scanning the house. "We've corresponded," he said, "before she left Nebraska. Thought I'd check how she's faring." I didn't answer right away. Something about his tone rubbed wrong. Too smooth, too sure. I told him she was in town, but she'd be back soon. He said he'd wait. We sat on the porch, the silence between us heavy. He talked about business back east, about opportunity, about how a woman like Annie deserved more than dust and cattle. I let him talk. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and heat. When he finally paused, I said, "She's not the sort who measures worth by a shine." He smiled, polite, but there was a glint behind it. "Maybe," he said, "but people forget what they deserve when they stay too long in one place." Annie rode in near mid-afternoon. The moment she saw him, her face changed. Not fear, more like the shock of finding an old wound reopened. "Oh, Jonah," she said. Her voice was flat. He stood, tipping his hat again. "Annie, you look well." She didn't answer. I could see her jaw tighten. "You shouldn't have come," she said. He stepped closer. "I only came to see that you were happy." She looked at me, then back at him. "I am," she said. That should have ended it, but Jonah wasn't built to walk away when someone told him no. He kept smiling that easy smile and said, "I still have your letters." The silence after that felt colder than the shade. Annie's eyes flashed. "Burn them," she said. "They don't mean what they used to." Jonah shrugged. "Maybe not to you. To me, they're proof you settled for less." I stood then. My voice came out low. "Mister, you've said enough." He looked at me, all arrogance and silk. "No offense, Caldwell. Just reminding her what she's worth." Annie stepped forward before I could. She said, "I know what I'm worth. And I didn't need you to tell me then, and I sure don't need you to tell me now." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jonah gave a small laugh, swung up onto his horse, and said, "Have it your way." He rode off, dust rising behind him. Annie stood watching until he vanished. Her hands were clenched tight at her sides. I said, "You all right?" She nodded once, but her eyes were wet. I took her hand. "He doesn't know you," I said. She answered, "Maybe, but he knew who I used to be." That night, she sat on the porch long after dark. The lamplight touched her face in pieces. I sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm. She said quietly, "I thought I buried that part of me. I thought if I worked hard enough, the past would stay quiet." I told her the past's like a horse with a bad temper. You can't break it, but you can teach it to walk beside you. She smiled, faint but real. "I reckon I'll hold the reins then." We didn't speak of Jonah again, but something had shifted. A weight lifted, though it left behind a tenderness I didn't expect. She moved through the days with a steadier step, lighter somehow. I realized that when she came here, she carried more than a carpet bag. She carried shame, comparison, the ghost of someone else's reflection. Now, bit by bit, she was laying it down. One evening near harvest, we sat by the river. The sky was wide open, the kind of blue that makes a man believe in mercy. Annie skimmed a stone across the water. It skipped twice, then sank. She said, "You ever wish things had gone another way?" I thought for a while before answering. "Used to," I said, "but not anymore." She nodded. "Me neither." The wind picked up, soft and warm. I took her hand. She didn't pull away. I told her I meant to make things right, that I'd like her to stay, proper as my wife if she'd have me. She turned to me slow, eyes bright but steady. "You mean it?" she asked. Every word I said. She looked toward the horizon, then back at me. "Then let's stop pretending it's anything less." We were married a week later, quiet and simple. Hattie Rose, the neighbor widow, came to witness. We said our vows under the cottonwoods, the air thick with sunlight and dust motes. I remember her voice when she said "I do," soft, certain, like a promise the land itself could hear. I slid the ring on her finger, and something inside me settled for the first time in years. That night, the house glowed warm, the lamp throwing slow shadows across the walls. She cooked a small supper, and we ate without ceremony. When she reached across the table to pour coffee, her hand brushed mine, and I felt it then. The peace I'd been chasing since the war, the kind that doesn't shout or shine, it just stays. Later, when she stepped outside to look at the stars, I followed. The wind moved through her hair, and she said, "I used to think love was something you had to earn. Now I think maybe it's something you choose every day." I told her that sounded right. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a long time we stood there, listening to the crickets and the far-off lowing of cattle. I remember thinking that night that the world had turned quiet just to let us breathe. But peace never stays without a test. I didn't know then that trouble was already on its way, riding in the shape of the past that never quite learns to die. It was near the end of September when the past found us again. The mornings had turned sharp, the air carrying the promise of frost. Annie had started wearing my old coat when she went out to gather eggs, sleeves rolled twice at the wrists. I liked seeing her in it, made the place feel claimed. That day began simple. She was baking bread. I was oiling the saddle leather out on the porch. The smell of yeast and coffee drifted through the open door. I remember thinking how ordinary happiness feels right before it breaks. A horse's hooves sounded from down the trail. Slow, deliberate, not a neighbor's pace. I set down the rag, shaded my eyes, and saw two riders coming. One man wore a brown duster. The other, my gut turned cold, was Jonah Cooper. They reined up by the fence. The stranger spoke first. "Afternoon. I'm looking for Jesse Caldwell." I said he'd found him. The man nodded. "Sheriff Hale," he said, "Jonah here's made a complaint. Something about a woman promised in good faith and taken under false pretense." I felt the world tighten around me. Annie stepped onto the porch just then, wiping flour from her hands. Jonah looked at her the way a man looks at something he's lost and wants to blame someone for losing. Sheriff tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am." Jonah stepped forward. "Annie," he said, "you can end this right now. Come back east. You don't belong here." Annie's face went still. She said, "Sheriff, did this man tell you I came here by choice?" The lawman looked uneasy. He said there was correspondence, arrangements. She crossed her arms. "There was. Between him and my sister. I am not her." Jonah's mouth tightened. "She used your name. You know that." She smiled, but it wasn't kind. "She used my name the way you use anything you don't respect. But I'm done paying her debts." Sheriff Hale shifted in his saddle. "Well, if that's so, then there's no charge I can press." He looked at Jonah. "Seems like a private matter, sir." Jonah's face flushed dark. "You're making a mistake," he said. The sheriff touched his brim, turned his horse, and started down the trail. Jonah stayed a moment longer, He looked at me, then at Annie. "You'll regret this," he said. Then he rode off, dust curling behind him. Annie didn't move until the sound of hooves faded. Then she went inside, took the bread from the oven, and set it on the table. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clear. She said, "He won't let it rest." I said, "He'll learn." She met my gaze, "And if he doesn't?" I said, "Then we will." That night she couldn't sleep. I woke to find her standing by the window, staring into the dark. "You thinking about him?" I asked. She shook her head. "Thinking about me? About how much of the past a person can outrun before it starts chasing the ones they love." I stood beside her, the moonlight touching the scar on her wrist. "You're not running anymore," I said. "You're home." She turned, leaned into me, and for the first time, I felt her rest her full weight against me. No walls, no half measure. Days passed, quiet on the surface. Jonah didn't come back, but I felt his shadow stretching west. Then one morning, I found the barn door open. One of the geldings gone. Tracks led toward town. I followed them as far as the main road and saw the print of 2 horses, one shod, one not. My jaw tightened. Jonah had been here. When I returned, Annie met me on the porch. She didn't ask, she knew. I told her the truth anyway. He took the bay. She looked out at the horizon. "He'll come back for more," she said, "not just the horse." I nodded, then let him come. The next week, the rains returned. Heavy, cold, relentless. We patched the roof by lantern light, laughing when the water found new holes faster than we could fix them. It felt good to laugh, to push against something bigger than fear. But underneath it, I could sense the storm wasn't only in the sky. One night, long after we'd gone to bed, the dogs started barking. Not the kind of bark they give a fox or coyote. This was closer. Angry. I reached for the rifle by the door. Annie was already up, lamp in hand. Through the window I saw movement by the barn. 2 shapes, one with a lantern. I stepped outside, rain slick underfoot. Jonah's voice carried through the dark. "I just came for what's mine, Caldwell," I said. "You already took a horse." He laughed. "Not the one I came for." The words burned through the rain. Annie stepped onto the porch behind me. Jonah saw her and lifted the lantern higher. She flinched from the light, but stood her ground. He said, "You were supposed to be Evelyn. The mistake was mine to fix. I raised the rifle. That's far enough." He sneered. "You won't shoot me. You're too decent for that." He took 1 step forward. The dogs growled low. The sheriff's words from that day echoed in my head. Private matter. Out here, private meant no help coming. I sighted down the barrel. "Leave now, Jonah." The rain hissed between us. Annie said quietly, "Don't. I won't have you ruin your soul for him." Jonah laughed, wild and brittle. "Soul?" He dropped the lantern. It hit the mud and went out. Darkness swallowed the yard. I heard the scrape of boots, the shuffle of a struggle, then a shout. Hers or mine, I couldn't tell. The rifle fired once. The flash lit everything. The barn, the rain, his face twisted in rage. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, Jonah was gone, running toward the trees, one hand pressed to his arm. The dogs chased him to the fence line and stopped. I lowered the gun, chest heaving. Annie stood by the porch rail, pale but steady. "You didn't kill him," she said. I nodded. "No." She came down the steps, took the rifle from my hands, and set it inside the door. Then she held my face between her palms. "He can't touch us anymore." For days after, the rain didn't stop. The creek rose, licking at the banks. We stayed close, working by turns, saying little. The land smelled new again. When the storm finally broke, the world shone clean. The next morning, I found Jonah's lantern near the fence. The glass was cracked, the flame long gone. I left it there, half buried in mud. The sheriff rode by a week later, said Jonah had headed east, wounded, swearing he was done with Wyoming. I thanked him. When he left, Annie said, "It's finished." I told her, maybe now we can start living instead of surviving. That night, she took the letter from Evelyn, the one she'd left on the mantel, and held it over the lamp flame. The paper curled, blackened, and fell into ash. She watched it burn without a word. When it was gone, she turned to me and said, "No more ghosts." I pulled her close. The smell of smoke clung to her hair. Outside, the stars were sharp enough to cut. She said, "Do you ever wonder if everything that went wrong had to, just to bring us here?" I told her I'd stopped asking why. Some mercies only make sense when you stop trying to explain them. She smiled, small and sure. "Then let's keep this one." And so we did. For a while, peace stayed. The ranch healed, the grass grew, and the sound of laughter came easier. But even peace carries its own kind of reckoning, and time has a way of testing what a man claims to believe. Winter came early that year, rolling in with a wind that carried the bite of mountains. The cottonwoods went bare, and the air smelled of iron and wood smoke. Annie took to wearing a scarf I'd knitted from an old blanket, rough but warm. She said it scratched, but she wore it anyway. I think she liked the story in it more than the comfort. By the first snow, the ranch had gone quiet except for the lowing of cattle and the sound of the axe splitting logs. We worked side by side, breath fogging in the cold. Nights, we'd sit by the fire, boots drying near the hearth, the light soft on her face. I'd catch her sometimes, staring into the flames, eyes far away. When I asked, she'd say she was listening to the wind, to the old board settling, to whatever the land whispered when everything else went still. The war still visited me in dreams. Sometimes I'd wake gasping, the smell of gunpowder clinging to the dark. Annie would turn toward me, hand on my chest, until my breathing found its rhythm again. She never asked what I saw. She just stayed until the shaking passed. A man doesn't forget that kind of mercy. One night, near Christmas, I found her outside. Snow had been falling since dusk, and the world was white as linen. She stood near the fence, face lifted to the sky, flakes catching in her hair. I asked if she was cold. She said, "Maybe a little, but it's the good kind, the kind that tells you you're alive." She reached out, let a snowflake melt on her glove. "Do you ever think about the ones who didn't get to come home?" I nodded. "Every day." She looked at me, eyes deep and steady. "Then live enough for them," she said. We spent the holidays alone, but not lonely. She baked bread sweet with honey, and I carved her a small wooden box with a lid that fit true. She kept it by her bedside, said it reminded her that even rough hands could make something fine. In January, a letter arrived addressed to me. The handwriting was rough, unfamiliar. It was from Jonah. He wrote from a town in Missouri. Said he was alive, but marked by what he called his own foolish pride. He said he wanted no trouble, that he hoped the woman I'd married found peace. I read the words twice, then handed the letter to Annie. She looked at it a long time, then fed it to the fire. "No more ghosts," she said again, same as before. February stretched long and mean. One morning, The well froze solid. We had to break ice from the creek for water. Annie laughed when I slipped on the bank, though she nearly went in herself trying to help me up. The sound of her laughter echoed off the hills, clean and wild. I'd forgotten how much joy could live inside a single voice. At night, she read to me. Old stories, some from scripture, some from a book her father had given her. I liked her voice when she read, steady, low, each word landing sure. Sometimes she'd stop mid-sentence, smile, and say, I like this part. Then she'd read it again, softer, like she was tasting the truth inside the line. In March, a sickness moved through the valley. Nothing cruel, just a fever that came fast and left slow. A few of the hands in town took to bed. Hattie Rose, our nearest neighbor, fell ill. Annie packed broth and blankets, said she was going. I told her it wasn't safe. She looked at me, calm as sunrise. Safe doesn't always mean right. She rode out that morning, snow still deep in the shadows. I watched until the bay disappeared behind the ridge. 3 days later, she came back, tired, face pale, eyes bright with that fierce kind of relief that comes from doing good. Hattie's better, she said. So am I. She dropped her gloves on the table, hands shaking. I made her sit, poured coffee, and told her she'd scared 10 years off my life. She smiled. Guess we're even again. She said spring took its time. The snow melted slow, feeding the creek till it ran full. The earth thawed, soft and dark. Annie planted seeds in a line so straight, you'd think the soil itself obeyed her will. She said life comes back if you let it. I said, you sound sure. She looked at me, hand resting on the hoe. I've seen worse things rise again, she said. One evening in April, we walked the ridge above the ranch. The sky burned orange at the edges, clouds turning the color of old copper. Annie stopped, looked out over the land, and said, Do you ever think about forever? I said, Sometimes. She nodded. I don't think it's years or heaven or even love. I think forever's the way a place remembers you when you're gone. Her words stuck with me. The next morning, I carved our initials into the porch rail, small and neat, just below where her hand always rested. She noticed later, smiled, and traced the letters with her thumb. Looks right there, she said, like it always belonged. By May, the valley bloomed, the cattle calved, the grass returned green and thick. The sound of life filled every corner of the land. Annie moved through it like someone born to belong. There were days I'd catch her humming while she worked, and I'd stop just to listen. The kind of peace she carried wasn't loud. It was steady, the kind that holds a man upright without him noticing. Then one afternoon, while we were stacking hay, she paused, pressed a hand to her chest, and went still. I dropped my fork, ran to her. She said she was fine, just winded, but her skin had gone pale. I made her sit in the shade, brought water. She drank slow, eyes closed. I told her she needed a rest. She said, the work won't do itself. I said, then it can wait. That night, she insisted she was better. We ate supper, quiet. She smiled like she always did, but it didn't reach her eyes. After we cleaned the table, she said, let's walk to the river. The moon was full, the water shining silver. She took my hand, held it tight. If something ever happens, she said, promise you'll keep the land. Promise you'll let it stay what it is. I told her nothing was going to happen. She smiled again. I know, but promise anyway. I promised. She kissed my cheek, soft and warm, then turned toward the house. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time she ever walked that far with me. 2 mornings later, I found her by the window, still in her chair, eyes closed, face peaceful. The sun had just started to rise. The light touched her hair and turned it to gold. She looked like she was listening to the wind one last time. I stood there for a long while, not breathing, not moving. Outside the world went on. Roosters crowed. The river kept running. The sky kept brightening. I knelt beside her, took her hand. It was still warm. I whispered, "You kept your promise, Annie. Now I'll keep mine." The days that followed blurred. The neighbors came, helped dig a place on the hill above the pasture where she liked to stand at dusk. We laid her there under the cottonwoods, the earth soft and rich. I carved her name into a flat stone, plain and true. No dates, no scripture, just her name, and below it the word chosen. When the last of them left, I sat by the grave until night. The stars came out, one by one, slow and patient. I said her name aloud, just to hear it in the air. The sound carried across the fields, and for a heartbeat, I swear the wind answered back. Grief has a sound. It isn't the wail people expect. It's quieter. The scrape of a chair on wood. The creak of a door that still opens to no one. The clink of a cup set down for two out of habit. For weeks, I moved through that silence like a man underwater. Every corner of the house carried her touch. The flower jar she kept by the stove, the scarf folded on the bed, the small wooden box I'd carved sitting open on the shelf. Inside it were seeds she'd meant to plant this spring. The days stretched long. I worked because work kept the heart from unraveling completely. Cattle still needed tending. Fences didn't care about sorrow. At night, I'd sit on the porch and watch the light fade. The ridge would darken first, then the pastures, until the world was nothing but the outline of what once was. I'd speak to her sometimes, soft, the way I used to when she was out hanging laundry. It wasn't madness, it was memory, trying to stay warm. Hattie Rose came by one afternoon with a basket of biscuits and a look that didn't pity so much as understand. She sat, folded her hands, and said, "The good ones always make the quiet louder when they go." I nodded. She said, "You should come to church again, Jesse. There's comfort in the hymns, even when you can't sing." I told her I wasn't sure God had much left to say to me. She smiled, not offended. "Then maybe you just go to listen." That night, I found the Bible Annie used to keep by the bed. Her handwriting filled the margins, small notes, bits of thought, a verse underlined twice. "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the rose." I read it again and again, until the letters blurred. Spring came late. When it did, I kept her promise. I planted her seeds, neat rows of wildflowers along the fence. The ground was stubborn at first, but she'd always said the earth only yields to patience. By May, green shoots had started to push through. The first bloom opened on a Sunday morning, pale blue against the dust. I caught myself smiling, the kind that hurts and heals at once. One evening, Hattie stopped by again, said there was a drifter in town asking after me. A young man, polite, said his name was Eli Cooper. I froze at that surname, but she shook her head. "Not kin to the other one," she said. "This one's looking for work." I needed help for the summer, so I told her to send him up. Eli arrived the next day. Lean, quiet, eyes like the sky after a storm. He said he'd been on the trail since Texas, knew cattle and mending fence. I hired him on the spot. We worked side by side in the fields, not saying much. After a few days, he asked about the grave on the hill. I told him the truth. My wife's resting there. He nodded slow. She must have been something. She was, I said. Still is. As weeks went by, the ranch began to sound alive again. Eli had a way of talking to the horses that settled them. I found myself teaching him the small things. How to read the weather by the way the cattle bunched. How to mend wire without cutting your hand. One night, as we finished supper, he said, "You ever think about leaving this place?" I looked out the window, where the moonlight brushed the porch rail with our initials carved there. "No," I said. "Everything I ever needed learned to stay." Summer came, and with it, the flowers along the fence exploded into color, blue and yellow the way Annie would have liked. The wind carried their scent across the yard. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watch them sway, and it felt like she was near, not as a ghost, but as something truer, like the land breathing her name. One night, the air turned warm and still, heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't come yet. I poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, set one across the table. Old reflex. Eli saw and said nothing. When he'd gone to bed, I sat there a while, staring at that untouched cup. Then I walked it outside, poured it into the earth by her grave. "For you," I said. The ground drank it in, dark and grateful. As the months passed, I learned to live inside the quiet without fearing it. The nightmares came less. When they did, I'd go to the porch, breathe in the cool night, and let the sound of the creek remind me where I was and who I'd been allowed to become. In early August, a letter arrived from Evelyn. The handwriting was shaky, the paper creased from travel. She wrote that Jonah had died the winter before, pneumonia. She said she wanted no forgiveness, only to tell me she remembered her sister's kindness more than her own mistakes. She ended with a line that struck deep. "If you ever speak her name, tell her she was always the brave one." I folded the letter and set it under a smooth stone on Annie's grave. Then I sat down beside it and said, "Hear that, Annie? Even she remembers." The wind came up gentle, moving through the cottonwoods, and I swear it sounded like her laughter, low and certain. By the end of that summer, the ranch had grown quiet again, but not the empty kind. It was quiet that held life inside it. The creek ran steady. The flowers she'd planted leaned into the wind. Eli planned to head south before the snow came. I gave him a horse and half a month's pay extra. He said, "You sure?" I nodded. "Take the road, son. Find what's yours." He asked, "What if I never do?" I told him, "Then keep riding till the road feels like home." After he left, I stood by the fence, watching the dust settle. The sun was setting behind the ridge, turning the sky the color of rust and honey. I thought about Annie's words, that forever might be the way a place remembers you. The wind lifted through the grass, carrying the scent of her flowers, and for the first time since she left, I believed it. Now the nights come soft. I still light the lamp she used, still sit by the window as the stars appear. Sometimes I talk to her, sometimes I just listen. The land answers in its own way, the sigh of grass, the slow rhythm of a world that keeps forgiving. And when the morning breaks, I step outside, tip my hat to the hill, and start another day. Because that's what love asks of the living, to stay, to tend, to remember. Years slide past, quieter than a wagon in sand. You don't notice the weight until you look behind you and see the marks it left. I stayed on that ranch because leaving felt like tearing out roots. The seasons turned and turned again, carving their patience into me. The first years after Annie's passing, I kept to myself mostly. Folks in town would nod when I came for supplies, talk a bit about weather and cattle prices, then let me go. They meant kindness, but small talk cuts thin when your heart's already threadbare. I learned to find company in simpler things. The creek thawing each spring, the scent of wet earth, the low comfort of wind in the cottonwoods. The garden she planted never failed. Every summer it came back wild, more color than sense, a tumble of bloom against the fence line. I never cut them for the house. They belonged where she left them, rooted, reaching. Sometimes children from town would ride up, ask if they could pick a few for Sunday service. I always said yes. Seeing their small hands gather what she'd sown felt like her gift carrying on. One afternoon, late in the season, I heard a wagon pull up. Hattie Rose climbed down, slower now, hair silver as winter grass. She carried a pie wrapped in cloth. She said, "Jesse, it's been too long since you sat with folks. We're having a supper at the church this Sunday." I told her I wasn't much for gatherings. She smiled that knowing way. "No one's asking you to be. Just come eat, listen to some fiddle, let the world remind you it's still turning." That Sunday, I went. The church smelled of pine boards and candle wax. Children ran between pews, laughter bouncing off the walls. I sat near the back, hat in my lap, and let the music wash over me. They sang, "Shall we gather at the river?" And somewhere in the middle of that song, I felt something loosen, like a door inside me swinging open just enough for air to come through. After the service, a young woman approached, holding a tray of coffee cups. She couldn't have been more than 20. She said, "Mr. Caldwell, my mother used to tell me stories about your wife. Said she was the kindest soul on this side of the divide." I looked at her, trying to place the name. "You're Hattie's niece," I said. She nodded. "Mama said Annie used to bring her soup when she was sick as a child." She smiled then, shy but bright. I reckon that kindness stuck. That night, walking home under a moon big as a promise, I thought about how the smallest acts keep echoing long after the voices fade. The land holds them, and maybe so does God. Winter returned slow. The house creaked in the cold, and the stove burned steady. I began writing again. Nothing fancy, just small notes in a ledger. Weather, cattle counts, memories when they came. I found that when I wrote, I could hear Annie clearer, like she was standing behind me, nodding. One entry reads, "Today, the wind smelled like rain and lilac." She would have said the earth was remembering itself. Another, "The fox den by the ridge has 3 kids." She would have left milk out. Little things, but enough to build a life from. Years passed this way. I grew slower, shoulders rounded by time. My hands stiffened, but I could still mend wire and lift a saddle. When the pain got bad, I'd sit by the window and tell myself she'd laugh to see me grumble. Then one spring morning, I woke to hoofbeats. A rider was coming fast down the trail. I stepped outside, hand shading my eyes. It was a boy, no, a man now, riding a chestnut I recognized. Eli Cooper. He swung down, taller, leaner, the years making him into something steady. He said, "Mr. Caldwell, I was heading north. Thought I'd pay my respects." I smiled, took his hand. "You found what was yours then," he grinned. Not sure yet, but the road feels like home. We sat on the porch a while, catching up. He told me of work in Montana, of rivers clear as glass, of a woman he'd met who reminded him of the plains. He said he hoped to build something of his own soon. Before he left, he looked toward the hill and said, "She'd be proud, you know." I nodded. She always was. He rode off with the sun behind him, and I stood there until the dust settled. That evening, I walked up to her grave. The flowers had started again, wild and stubborn. I sat beside them and spoke as I always did, telling her about Eli, about the pie Hattie had brought last week, about the spring that smelled of rain and forgiveness. The sky blushed pink, then darkened to violet. I said, "You were right, Annie. Forever isn't years. It's what the land remembers, and it remembers you well." The wind came soft across the field, lifting the edge of my coat, stirring the grass. Somewhere far off, thunder muttered, not a threat, but a promise of rain. I closed my eyes and listened, the sound of it steady as breath. When I opened them again, the stars had begun to show. The first one hung low, right above the ridge. I tipped my hat to it, same as I did every night, and started the slow walk back to the house. Inside, the lamp burned low, the air still carrying the faint scent of her bread from a lifetime ago. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and let the quiet settle around me. The ranch stretched out dark and endless, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. The land had taken her, but it had given her back in 1,000 small ways. The flowers, the wind, the steady hum of living. I thought about all that had passed. The girl who came instead of her sister, the storm, the fire, the loss, the years. Every bit of it had carved something true. Before I went to bed, I wrote one last line in the ledger. Peace isn't found. It's chosen, same as love. Then I closed the book, set it on the shelf beside hers, and let the house fall quiet again. I reckon time teaches a man more about gentleness than youth ever could. The older I got, the more I understood that nothing worth keeping stays the same. The land changes, the river shifts, the faces in town come and go like seasons. But there's a mercy in that too. Change is the way God keeps us moving, even when our boots grow heavy. Most mornings I still wake before sunrise. Habit more than need. The world holds its breath just before the light comes, and for a few heartbeats, everything feels suspended. The air, the silence, the waiting. I sit with my coffee, looking toward the hill where Annie rests. The mist always finds her first. It curls around the cottonwoods, soft as prayer. The ranch is smaller now. I sold off the far pasture to a family with 3 kids and a pair of good horses. The youngest boy comes by sometimes, asks me to tell stories of the old days, of the war, the floods, the storm that nearly took the barn. But what he loves most are the tales about Annie. He listens wide-eyed while I tell him about the woman who came instead of her sister and chose to stay. About how she could calm a skittish horse with a whisper, how she saved a calf in the flood, how she laughed when the roof leaked because at least the sky remembered us. He asked me once if I missed her. I said missing is what keeps love honest. If you ever stop missing someone who mattered, then you've stopped being who they loved. The boy nodded solemnly, like he understood, though he couldn't yet. Sometimes I take that same boy and his brothers down to the creek. We fish for trout, though we rarely catch more than one. They splash and shout while I sit on a rock watching the current. The water still runs over the same stones Annie once stood beside, clear and cold. I think she liked knowing laughter lives here again. At night, when the house settles, I read aloud from her Bible. I'm slower now, the words thick in my throat, but they still carry weight. One verse in particular finds me each time. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. I used to think that was about faith. Now I think it's about endurance, how even barren ground can bloom when someone believes in it long enough. That's what Annie did for me. She made something live where I thought nothing would grow again. Hattie passed a few winters back. The church bells rang slow and low. The whole valley came to see her off. I stood by her grave after they filled it in, hat pressed to my chest. I whispered thanks for her friendship, her blunt wisdom, and for being the one who always reminded me that grace isn't loud. That spring, I fixed the fence on the north ridge one last time. My knees complained, my back too, but the work felt right. I drove the posts deep, tied the wire tight, and when I finished, I looked out across the fields. The sun was setting, painting everything gold. I thought of the day Annie arrived, dust on her dress, eyes steady, and how that single step off the train changed every mile after. Later that week, the preacher's daughter came riding up with a new ledger. She said, "Mama said you might want this, seeing as the old one's full." I thanked her and offered to pay, but she waved it off. Said her mother wanted me to keep writing. "You've got stories that need to stay," she said. That night, I opened the ledger and wrote. She came instead of another, but became the only one that mattered. Then I stopped, sat back, and let the weight of it settle. Some truths don't need polishing. They shine on their own. The winters grew shorter for me after that. The body weakens, but the spirit, it learns how to stretch beyond what bones can hold. I began to dream of her more often, but not as lost. She'd be there in the dreams, same as before, by the river, hair loose in the wind, smiling like the world was simple again. Sometimes she'd say nothing. Sometimes she'd whisper, "Keep the fire lit." On the anniversary of her passing, I rode to town, bought 2 new saplings, cottonwoods, same kind that stand watch over her grave. I planted them by the creek where we'd once camped that first night. My hands shook, but the roots took easy. I watered them slow and said, "You're not alone here, Annie. The land remembers." A few weeks later, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled through the eaves. I sat by the fire, listening. The sound brought back that night we'd fought to save the calf. The lightning, the fear, her hand on my cheek. I closed my eyes, let the storm speak. It didn't sound like danger anymore. It sounded like home. When morning came, the world outside was washed clean again. The creek ran high. The air smelled of sage and renewal. I walked out to her grave. The new trees had held fast through the wind. Drops still clung to their leaves, catching the light like tiny mirrors. I looked up at the sky and said, "I'm still here, still choosing, still yours." Then I sat for a while, watching the clouds drift east, slow and forgiving. The land stretched out in every direction, alive with all we lived. And for the first time, I understood that healing isn't a moment. It's a lifetime spent learning how to love what remains. The years have thinned me down to bone and breath, but the mornings still find me here. I wake to the same light, creeping through the cracks in the boards, to the same sound of wind easing through cottonwood leaves. The porch rail is smooth now, worn by my hand resting there each day when I tip my hat toward the hill. Annie's name is still sharp on that stone, the word chosen beneath it still clean. Time hasn't managed to weather it down, though it's had plenty of chances. I don't ride much anymore. The horses are gone, sold or buried. I keep a mule for company, stubborn old thing that listens better than most men. We walk the fence together when the air's cool. I talk, he chews. It's a rhythm, the kind that keeps a man from forgetting what his own voice sounds like. The young family that bought the far pasture comes by now and then. Their oldest boy, Thomas, helps with wood chopping and feed. He brings his mother's stew, sets it by the stove, and tells me about his lessons in town. He asked me once if I was ever lonely out here. I told him the truth. I used to be, but not anymore. He said, because of God. I smiled. Because of love, I said, then added, sometimes that's the same thing. The nights run longer these days. I've taken to sitting by the fire till the logs go red and crumble. The flames sound like rain when they fall, soft and even. That's when she comes back to me the clearest, not as a ghost, not as a dream, but as memory so strong it carries its own heat. I can see her there, sleeves rolled, hair coming loose, eyes that could look through dust and find something worth keeping. She used to say the land remembers us. I believe her now. Every spring, the flowers she planted bloom again, spilling color across the fence line like a wave that refuses to end. The scent reaches the porch before sunrise, sharp and sweet. I sit there breathing it in, thinking that maybe forever smells a little like that, like soil and bloom and the echo of hands that once cared enough to tend it. There's a calm in me I never thought I'd earn. It's quiet, but it hums steady, like the earth itself has finally forgiven my stubborn heart. I was to carry the war in my chest, the thunder of it, the ghost that wouldn't fade. But the years and Annie's grace worked together on me the way wind smooths stone. Now when storms come, I don't flinch. I just listen. A few weeks back, the preacher stopped by. He said, "Jesse, you've outlived most every soul who rode into this valley when you did. How do you feel about that?" I told him I'm not counting years anymore. I'm counting sunrises. He laughed, said that sounded like a good trade. Before he left, he asked if there was anything I needed. I looked around, the house, the hill, the stretch of pasture fading into distance, and I said, "Nothing missing here, not anymore." Sometimes when the air goes still and the sky holds that deep, forgiving blue, I take her Bible out to the porch. The pages are thin as breath, but they haven't torn. I open to her verse, "The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose." I read it aloud, the words rolling slow through the air. I reckon that's what she did for me. Took a dry, stubborn patch of ground and made it bloom. Evenings come gentle now. I light the lamp, same one she used, and the glow fills the room the way her laughter once did. I pour a cup of coffee, take one sip, then pour the rest outside by the steps. The soil takes it every time. I like to think she tastes it somehow. When I lie down at night, I keep the window open. The stars hang close. The wind moves soft through the curtains. I hear the river talking low, steady as prayer. My body's tired, but my heart feels light. Some nights, I dream of her walking down that trail again, the same one she took the day she arrived. She's wearing that plain blue dress, dust at the hem, sunlight in her hair. She smiles like she knows something waiting just ahead. Maybe that's where she is. Maybe that's where I'll go when the time comes. Down that same trail, toward that same light, the dust lifting behind me, the air sweet with rain. Till then, I'll keep tending what's left. The flowers, the vents, the small fire that never dies out. I'll keep telling our story to whoever asks, and to the land itself when no one's around. Because that's what love does. It remembers. It endures. It turns loss into living. And when my last morning comes, I hope the sun finds me here, hat in hand, looking east, whispering her name into the wind one more time. That'll be enough.